Hello everyone, I'm Kathryn DeSinaasappelen, and today we're talking about France and all the things I hated about it. So my last video where I talked about my negative experience in France, you can watch it wherever links are. So here's my disclaimer for this video before we even begin. If you take nothing away, take this away. My opinion on France is based on the fact that I studied there for a year and then lived there for 10 years. So if you want to be invited to this table, the only way I'm going to respect your opinion is if you can match your experience with mine. If you're going to tell me that your best friend's sister's dog's owner had a bad time somewhere, like, I'm gonna laugh at you. That being said, if you are somebody that is looking to go and live abroad, take any experience, whether it's positive or negative, with a grain of salt. And instead of saying, this will definitely happen, or this won't happen at all, you should ask yourself instead, would this situation bother me? And if you say, no, it wouldn't, ask yourself, why not? Because you might think it won't, but unless you understand why it won't, that's not going to be helpful to you. And then if you say that it would, then figure out strategies and tools that you can use to make a prospective negative experience positive. Thus, without further ado, let's get into some things I did not enjoy while I was living in France. Number one, the language. The French are very particular when it comes to French. And it's the only place that I have gone to study or lived in where if you didn't speak the language, people were not nice to you at all. Since I was an expat, I normally easily made friends with other expats. And one of the observations that I made is that people who had a difficult time in the beginning normally always didn't speak French fluently. And the people who went to France who had a great time of it from the very beginning were people who spoke French at an advanced level. Sadly, I fell into the group where I had 3 years of French and I went to France and I realized, holy crap, I knew nothing. And unfortunately, when you learn a new language, I think everybody will have this innate fear of not wanting to sound like a complete idiot, or feeling that if I make a mistake, people are going to mock me. And like, I don't have positive experiences of learning French in France because all that crap happened. French people, I'm sorry to say, but like, some of you really are not nice to foreigners who are learning your language, and you need to really chill out, because there were times that it got so bad that I would go home and I would cry and think like I'm such an idiot and a failure because I couldn't speak French properly. Unfortunately, that's not a sentiment that entirely went away, because even after 10 years, I still would have people that would sort of mock my accent or just say these like little backhanded comments to me. It's just, after experiencing it over 10 years, I didn't really care anymore. And I also was able to get to a point that I was very thankful for all the torment that I got in the first couple years while I was learning French, because when your greatest fear about a language is somebody making fun of you and you experience that, you realize that the world doesn't end. The sun rises from the east, the world keeps spinning, and you figure it out. It takes time, but you get there. And what's great is I've noticed that when it came to other languages that I was learning, I didn't have that fear of speaking, and that's a compliment that I've always gotten, that I wasn't afraid to butcher a language. And that's a great skill that you can learn, but at the same time, I think you can only learn it if you go through that negative experience. So while it sucked, and I do wish that like French people could just be a little bit more nicer when it comes to people learning their language, I'm also thankful for all the crap that I got, because it just made learning all the other languages that I was interested in that much easier. Because, you know, if I went out and I didn't conjugate the verbs or I messed up the word order, it's like, well, what's the worst thing that you can do to me? Like, I've already been told to like go F off and call it an idiot. Like, at least I'm trying. So it really did give me that self-confidence later in life, but like in the beginning it sucked. So my advice to you is that if you're planning specifically to go to France, work on the language as much as possible before you go there, but also, you know, if you go out into the world and people just aren't nice to you, like, don't worry about it. That person is an idiot. You don't want to be friends with them. Just you do you, work on the language, don't worry about it, because at some point in the future, somebody's going to give you the ultimate compliment by asking you, where do you come from? Because you will eventually lose your accent and they won't be able to replace it. Number 2, making friends. So this is really not something that is just in France, but I will say that I do think that there is something cultural when it comes to making friends in France, because if you have conversations with French people, like French people themselves will be like, yeah, it's really difficult to make friends. And the sad thing is as a foreigner, you're going to generally be more interesting than your run-of-the-mill French person. So it's actually like this much easier for you than the French person, but it's still difficult. I think what adds to this difficulty, particularly if we're talking specifically with Americans and French, is there's this difference of idea when it comes to privacy. Things as an American that you normally wouldn't talk about, except with really close friends and family, are your everyday normal topics in France. But things that you would talk about like every single day, like with the cashier at the checkout, for example, private information. I found for myself this was problematic because if you want to have a conversation in France, you're probably going to have to talk about topics that are difficult for you to talk about. And what can happen is that because you're sharing this information that for you is really personal, you feel like you're giving more to the other person and not getting anything in return. And that's a difficult feeling to overcome. And I know to some extent I'm at fault for this because I've sabotaged relationships just because it got to the point where it was just so frustrating for me because I felt like I was giving so much of myself and I was in this like really vulnerable, raw position and I wasn't getting anything in return from the other person, and so I just cut them off. I do not have a fix for this. I don't have any advice on how to make it better because over the course of 10 years in France, I think I've managed like 5 French friends. They were all people who had gone to America to study abroad, and so they sort of got me and my quirks. But like the random French person, like I was never able to get through that shell and become friends with. And yeah, this is something that I've talked with other Americans and even other French people, and yeah, this is problematic. And I know so many people when they go to a foreign country, the first thing that they want to do is make a whole bunch of friends. And I'm not saying you won't ever make French friends. I'm just saying that if you're going there with the goal of making like 20 French friends, maybe just put the goal of talking to 20 French people. Because it is something, it takes a lot of time and it's probably going to be difficult on both parties because you're going to be reluctant to share information that they feel is normal to share. So they're going to think that you're hiding or holding back from them, so they're going to be reluctant to trust you. And when you do share this information that for you is really personal, you're going to feel like the relationship is one-sided. So it's really difficult because it's like you're fighting with psychology and cultural differences. And even when you know you're fighting these things, it's still difficult. So good luck. Keep trying, eventually you'll get there. You'll end up with 5 friends after 10 years at least. And number 3, the last, and probably going to be the most insulting, is nationalism. No. I swear, most of the conversations where they ended badly was always because somebody just was being a butthead because there was some random French thing that I didn't know about, and I didn't like that. You know, when you move to a new country, there's so much that you don't know that really it's so overwhelming because first off you have the language, and learning a new language is just like But then you have all this other stuff, cultural information that you just don't know it. Things that people just sort of instinctively know, or they grow up learning, and you won't know unless you ask. Things like, how does insurance work? How do you go to the hospital? What are you responsible for when you rent or buy a house? You know, these things that in your own home country you know, but go to a foreign country, it may be similar, it may be different. But then you have things like music, movies, literature. There's so much information that you will not have grown up with, and people will have, and they'll just assume that you should know it because they learned it at school. And that can be frustrating because some people, and I don't think they mean it in a malicious way, they don't think before they talk. The only advice I have for you in these situations is that no matter what, and this is so much easier said than done, is try to react in a positive light. Because negativity sticks more to the person throwing it than the person it's being thrown at. So a good example that I have is probably the last year that we lived in France. I was at this dinner party and we were talking about TV shows and movies, and there was some movie that had won all these awards at the Caesars. And if you don't know what the Caesars are, they're the French version of the Oscars. And I never heard about this movie, and this guy was just being a complete butthead about it and just like, how can you not know this movie? I turned to my husband and I asked if he knew about the movie, and he didn't. This is where it got really annoying for me, because once this guy realized that my husband didn't know about this movie, his whole attitude changed and he became a lot more friendly about the fact that neither one of us knew about the movie. And it upset me because it made me feel like the only reason why he was being a butthead to me is because of my particular nationality. And I hated this situation because I knew the only reason why my husband wasn't getting crap is because he was Belgian and he's part of the group, and it was reinforcement that I'm not part of the group. Ultimately, how I chose to handle that situation was to state that I wasn't somebody that really watched movies in English. I watched lots of French documentaries, and then I started talking about that, and nobody really knew about the documentaries that I was talking about. And it was sad because they were great documentaries about the monarchy or these castles or just the history of food in France. So it's not like I didn't care enough about French culture. I'm really not into movies. Sorry. If you're going to be somebody who lives in a foreign country, and again, this is so much easier said than done, you need to think of the long-term goal. You can't react to every little situation in a negative light, because people will be able to see that so-and-so is being a butthead. You don't need to point it out. They're smart enough to figure that out. After I showed that I wasn't bothered by it and that instead of watching movies, I watched documentaries, I got so many comments from people saying that, that they were really sorry about how this guy acted and they didn't think it was right. So they may not have called him out in the public forum, but I still had this support from people at the end of the day. And this is one of those situations, that's the best case scenario, because sometimes you don't get that, nice little comment at the end. You're sort of just there at the end feeling like everybody hates you, but realistically they probably don't. There are going to be buttheads. This can happen everywhere. It's just from my personal experience, I've had more problems with this in France than any other place that I've been. That being said though, you shouldn't let negative experiences stop you from going to the places that you want to go. You might not even go through any of this. You could have completely different problems wherever you're going. Each country is different, and the problems that you have in one country, you may not have in another country. The problems that I had in France are not the problems that I have in Belgium. The problems that I had in France do not even exist in Belgium. I have completely different problems, which I'll talk about next week. And that's what I have for you guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up. I hope not too many people were offended. If you were, I'm sure you will have keyboard warriored me in the comments, and I'll laugh at you, don't worry. If you've been abroad and have had some negative experiences and have some advice to share with people on how to either deal with it in a positive light or how to overcome that and not let it get to you in a negative way inside your heart, like leave those comments, because I think those are very useful, because sometimes something that is evident to one person is not evident to another person, and it might be the simplest solution out there, but there have been pieces of advice that have been offered to me and it's like, wow, I feel like an idiot for not thinking about that before. So please share and give your advice. I'd really appreciate it. And I'll see you guys in the next one. DeSinaasappelen, mijn appelsiens. Random observation, guys. The North is viewed as really rude and cold and distant. I think this is sort of true wherever you go, because even in America, us Northerners are sort of, you know, supposed to be rude and distant and cold. And I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a Northerner from America, but I find the Northerners in France to be the most polite people I've ever met.